Hello, and welcome to the Brain and Mind workshop. Thank you all very much for coming. We are very glad to be able to hold this event today after a two-term intermission. During the first lockdown, we held out hope for an in-person event in Michaelmas term. When that proved to be impossible, the college unfortunately did not yet have the necessary technology in place in order to sustain such a large-scale online event in addition to regular teaching. We are all the more grateful to St. Hilda's College, and particularly to Harris Ferguson and Claire Harvey, for providing the technological and administrative support that has made today's event possible. We hope to make the experience on Zoom equal to, or even better than normal. One advantage of being online is that we are joined today not only by A-level students from in and around Oxford, but also from researchers across the world who would not ordinarily be able to join. Among others, we are joined by a delegation from Hamburg in Germany, as well as researchers from Romania, France, the US, and China. Tonight will be somewhat different from previous events in that our speakers will be members of the Brain and Mind Executive Committee, rather than researchers external to St. Hilda's College. This is the reason why I and my colleague Annie Gore will be chairing today's event. My name is Barnaby Burley, and I am a graduate student in philosophy at St. Hilda's. Annie is a PhD student in cognitive neuroscience at University College London. She will now give you some background about the Brain and Mind workshop.
Hi, I'm Annie, and it's a pleasure to be a part of what promises to be a very interesting event. Brain and Mind was founded at St. Hilda's College in 2015. The workshop was designed with two central aims: fostering interdisciplinarity between psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience, and making accessible research from all three disciplines to non-specialists. In past years, the workshop has addressed various topics which are of joint interest to these disciplines. Discussions have included diverse phenomena, including, among others, time, addiction, perception, criminality, bilingualism, and emotion. Tonight,
we come together to address head-on the fundamental question which has been at the heart of the Brain and Mind workshop from the beginning. How do brain and mind relate? Hence, today's event gives us the opportunity to stand back and reflect on the very nature of the interdisciplinarity which the Brain and Mind workshop promotes. Our speakers today will share insights from their research, which will help to bring us closer to an understanding of what exactly it is that unites their disciplines. How does the brain relate to the body? And what do the neuroscientists' findings concerning the brain tell us about the nature of the mind? How is the psychologist's understanding of our mental capacities impacted by emerging accounts of the structure and functioning of the brain? And how might philosophy preserve what is distinctive and important in the study of mind, while acknowledging the central role which neuroscience tells us the brain plays when it comes to explaining our cognitive capacities? These are among the important questions that our speakers will address today.
We will hear three talks tonight, each approximately 20 minutes long. After the first talk, which will be from the perspective of neuroscience, we will have a short 5-minute break. We will then return to hear our second talk on psychology and education. After the second talk, we will have a 10-minute question and answer session, during which we welcome questions related to these first two talks. You can write your questions in the chat box as you listen to the speakers. Depending on how many questions there are, we may have to be selective in which ones are put to the speakers. We would encourage you to start your question by indicating your institution or profession, for example, A-level student, and then your question. After this Q&A, we will have another 5-minute break and then come back to hear our final talk from the perspective of philosophy. There'll be more time for questions on any of the talks after this.
It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Maike Glitsch. Dr. Glitsch has held the title of Muriel Tomlinson Tutorial Fellow at St. Hilda's College since 2009. She is a reviewing editor for the Journal of Physiology and a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology. Her research focuses on the regulation of synaptic transmission in the brain.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. A very warm welcome to everybody, and moin moin nach Hamburg. I'm going to disappear now so that I can start my presentation. Okay, it doesn't work. Okay, I hope this works. As I've already been introduced, I am a neuroscientist, and for me, thoughts and voluntary actions are consequences of physiological processes that occur in the brain, and in the case of actions, reach our muscles. These processes involve release of chemicals called neurotransmitter from neurons at synapses. Synapses are sites of information transfer between two neurons. The neuron releasing the neurotransmitter is the presynaptic neuron, and the neuron receiving the neurotransmitter is the postsynaptic neuron. Some postsynaptic neurons receive as many synapses as 200,000 from presynaptic neurons, but usually that number is much lower and typically anywhere between 1 and a few hundred synapses. And a given presynaptic neuron may in turn contact anywhere between 1 and thousands of postsynaptic neurons. So there can be a lot of divergence and convergence of information in neurons. Importantly, synapses can change in their strength in an activity-dependent manner, and their strength can be up or down regulated. Hence, some inputs may receive more importance than other inputs, and the same presynaptic stimulation may with time result in larger or smaller postsynaptic responses. We refer to this as synaptic plasticity, and we believe that these processes are essential for learning and memory formation, allowing us to store past experiences and to adjust our behaviors based on those experiences. These past experiences will influence decision-making processes and hence our actions. Neurons are interconnected throughout the nervous system, and their activity can be influenced by external and internal stimuli, and in turn influence muscle contractions leading to movement. So in a way, the brain is an elaborate processing organ that allows us to react appropriately to a stimulus. And by appropriate, I mean in a manner most likely to secure our survival or the survival of the species. We usually refer to an external stimulus as sensory input, such as visual, in this example here, auditory, touch, temperature, smell, taste, gravity, and also painful stimuli. Internal stimuli could be hormone levels in the blood, the stretched state of an internal organ, for instance, after eating or drinking, our stomach will be distended, or the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. So how does our brain arrive at the decision how to respond to a stimulus? To address this question, I'm going to start by considering a very simplified view of how the brain works. This view ignores consciousness and it purely focuses on how we engage with our environment. I have depicted the brain as 5 distinct systems here: the sensory, limbic, reward, decision-making, and motor system. In reality, there's some anatomical and functional overlap between these different systems, so the representation that you see here on screen is highly schematic and simplified. The sensory system is the input system to the brain, which picks up the presence or absence of a particular stimulus. The reward center makes predictions about whether a particular action is worthwhile doing, and it can do this either by guessing or based on past experiences. The limbic system is responsible for subconscious reactions to stimuli, and one of these subconscious reactions could be emotions, for instance. The limbic system also governs processes that maintain certain body parameters, such as the body temperature, within a narrow range of values to guarantee optimal functioning of the body. We call this body homeostasis. All these systems interact with each other, indicated by the arrows here, and the decision-making system. And it's the decision-making system that then makes a judgment as to what the most appropriate response to the stimulus and given the internal environment is. It then instructs the motor system, and this sets off events that culminate in movement. So we have one input system, the sensory system, and two output systems, the limbic and the motor system, whose outputs are distinct but complementary. The limbic system is responsible for subconscious responses that involve the release of hormones, as well as the modulation of cardiac muscle contraction and smooth muscle contraction. These responses are not under voluntary control and influence parameters such as blood pressure and dilation state of our pupils. The motor system output, on the other hand, is under voluntary control and influences the activity of skeletal muscles that control the movement of our bodies and body parts. Importantly, these muscles include our tongue and facial, as well as hand and finger musculature. And of course, this is hugely important to us as humans, as it allows us to control speech and enables the use of tools such as hammers, but also pens and keyboards. It is the activation of these muscles that enables me to interact with you and that I want to talk about today. And these are the ones that we can control and willingly influence. So let's delve into the motor system and its components. Skeletal muscles are effectors of the motor system. They contract or relax, thereby causing movement. How is their contraction state controlled? Skeletal muscles are innervated by so-called motor neurons. These are neurons that reside within the spinal cord and directly control the activity of muscle cells. The activity of motor neurons determines not only when a contraction takes place, but also the force of the contraction of the muscle cell. Think about how much force you apply when you pick up a raspberry compared to a glass marble of the same size. The former process requires a delicate grip, whereas the latter does not. So how do we adjust the force of contraction? Well, a muscle can consist of thousands to even tens of thousands of muscle cells, and each muscle cell is innervated by a motor neuron. The more each muscle cell is contracted, and the more muscle cells overall are contracted, the stronger the force of the contraction. The level of muscle cell contraction and number of muscle cells that contract are encoded in motor neuron activity patterns. The more active the motor neuron, the more contracted the muscle cells, and the more motor neurons innervating the same muscle are active at the same time, the stronger the force of the concentration. The question now is how motor neurons in the spinal cord are instructed by neurons in the brain. How do they know when to be active and how much force to generate? In order to fill the gap between external stimulus and activation of motor neuron, we need to return to the brain and the sensory system, i.e. the system that picks up the presence of the stimulus, processes it, and passes the information to other brain systems. It is very important to appreciate in this context that the same external stimulus can evoke distinct and conceivably opposite reactions in the same human being based on their internal state or after a formative event. For example, smelling cake may entice us to eat the cake if we're hungry, but if we're feeling sick, it may make us turn away and leave the room. Or we usually like eating a particular food, but on one occasion we eat a spoiled version of that food, which makes us feel violently sick afterwards, and from then onwards we avoid eating that particular food. Hence, sensory information has to be contextualized. Under what conditions do I sense the particular stimulus, and how does it tie in with everything else that is going on around and within me? The part where the highest level of processing of sensory information and contextualizing of information takes place in the brain is the so-called neocortex, more specifically, the association cortex. The association cortex combines all available information to create a perceptual experience of our environment, to allow us to engage with it, and that includes abstract thought and speech generation. Importantly, this processing also involves taking into account stored information, i.e. memories of past events. It is in the association cortex that the motivation and decision for a particular action in response to the external and internal environment is reached. This decision is then communicated to the motor system of the brain, which now needs to plan how best to carry out the desired action based on the current state of the body. For instance, a decision has been made to shake someone's hand. Exactly which muscles are going to be contracted, how much, will depend on our current body position. Do we need to get up to reach someone, or do we need to walk towards the person whose hand we want to shake? In addition, the movement needs to be programmed, i.e., the plan that lays out exactly which muscle is contracted when and how much needs to be organized so that the motor neurons in the spinal cord can be instructed in a timely and organized manner. Several different brain structures are involved in the planning and programming of motor programs, and a different one in the execution of motor programs. Three structures in particular are essential for the planning and programming of voluntary movements: the motor cortex, more specifically the premotor cortex, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. The premotor cortex is divided into two functional components, SMA and PMA. These two structures differ in that the SMA is more active when movements are intrinsically motivated, while the PMA is more active when a movement is more extrinsically motivated, that is, in response to sensory stimulation. In other words, the SMA is more involved in throwing a ball, and the PMA in catching a ball that is thrown in our direction. Accordingly, the SMA is active even when we just imagine carrying out a movement. And this is something that athletes take advantage of when they mentally rehearse movements. The PMA, in contrast, is active when we watch people carry out movements. And this allows us to imitate what other people are doing. The involved neurons are called mirror neurons because their activity mirrors the observed movement. The role of the basal ganglia is the selection of the most appropriate motor program for the desired outcome, given the circumstances as well as the triggering of these movements. Accordingly, pathologies of the basal ganglia display either lack of movements, such as in Parkinson's disease, or uncontrollable and involuntary movements, such as in Huntington's disease. The cerebellum is responsible for the fine-tuning of movements. Pathologies of the cerebellum result in poorly coordinated muscle contractions, but, and this is in contrast to lesions in the basal ganglia, movements are still possible and do not occur involuntarily. So to simplify, we can see the basal ganglia as responsible for the big picture, which movement will be carried out when, and the cerebellum as responsible for the nitty-gritty, exactly how much will the muscle be contracted and how do we coordinate different muscle groups to achieve our goal. The basal ganglia and the cerebellum communicate with the premotor cortex, which then passes on the optimized and final motor program to the primary motor cortex, which is essentially the output structure of the motor system. Neurons in the primary motor cortex then instruct the motor neurons in the spinal cord, thus leading to muscle contraction and hence movement. And this is how activity in the brain is translated into movement. Intriguingly, we can measure neuronal activity in higher motor centers in a person before said person is aware that they will carry out a particular movement. Or in other words, a movement decision is arrived at subconsciously. This might be taken as evidence that we're not altogether that different from the amoeba in this Gary Larson cartoon here, and raises the question why we say that movements are voluntary and under our control. This can be reconciled, however, when we consider that whilst movement decisions are made subconsciously, the moment they reach our consciousness, we can override them. In that sense, movements are voluntary in that we decide whether or not to go with a movement that was planned according to past experiences, external and internal cues, or to choose a different movement option. So whilst our brain will present us with what it thinks is the best muscle response to an internal and/or external stimulus, We are free, obviously within the constraints of physics and society, to override that subconscious decision and opt for another movement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glitsch, for a very interesting talk. We will now go into a short break until 5:30, at which time we will start again promptly with our next speaker. So please be back on time. But yeah, until then, go and get a drink or relax for a bit, and see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, so now it's past. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Dowker. Dr. Dowker is a research lecturer at the Department of Experimental Psychology in Oxford and a college lecturer in psychology at St Hilda's. Her research includes many aspects of developmental psychology and the psychology of individual differences, and her work covers a wide range of topics, including linguistic development, mathematical cognition, and theory of mind. Her work has influenced educational policy in the UK, and she is involved in many cross-cultural educational projects.
Just to say thank you very much, Annie, and I will now leave or at least cease to be visible on the screen in order to share my PowerPoint. Okay, can people hear? Excellent. So before we move on, can everybody see my PowerPoint?
Harris is about to put it on.
Hello, is it now visible?
Yes, it is.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, as you can see, I'm not as expert in doing this on Zoom as some people no doubt are. At any rate, this is going to be about the implications of neuroscience for the psychology of education, and in particular with regard to mathematics education. And there are quite a few findings in neuroscience which have been applied to education and have turned out to have quite important applications. There is controversy about how important and valid some of the findings are, which is not unique to neuroscience findings, but is often found with regard to almost any study in psychology and education. But I should start out with a warning about the dangers of misuse and oversimplification of some of the theories, at the risk of publicizing some of the more pernicious neuromyths, as they're sometimes called. I will give a couple of examples. In the words of Josh Billings, an American humorist, the trouble with most folks isn't so much their ignorance as their knowing so many things that ain't so. And we all know some things that ain't so in these days of media, whether social media or more traditional media, sometimes giving wrong explanations. And there are indeed many myths that have developed over the years about the brain and how it works, which can give quite misleading ideas about the nature of the brain, which can have negative impacts on education and other areas. So some of these are completely invented, of which perhaps the most notorious is we only use 10% of our brains. Some are distorted and exaggerated. So here is a diagram showing that we only use 10% of the brain, which is very definitely something that ain't so. We use all of our brains. And there are, and other theories involve the differences between the right and left hemispheres of the brain, sometimes distorted into right and left brains. So there are some functional differences between the left and right hemispheres of the brain in most people. Most notably, the left hemisphere is dominant for language. But it's not true that the left hemisphere is logical and the right hemisphere creative, or any of the other myths that get promoted about the left and right hemispheres having totally different personalities. And still less is it the case that there are left-brained people who are more logical and right-brained people who are more creative, more intuitive, etc. Simply not true. And there also is no evidence for the value of brain gym activities to integrate the two hemispheres, which is certainly a way that individuals and schools have been parted from their money by over-enthusiastic promoters of brain gym. And here, again, at the risk of publicizing what is, however, a well-known example, there is a diagram claiming that the left brain is responsible for language and right-hand control. Yes, it is, but also that it's responsible for analytic thought, logic, and reasoning, while the right brain is responsible for creativity, imagination, intuition, etc. None of this is true, and still less, as I said, are there some logical left-brained people and some right-brained imaginative people. Individual differences in such areas are due to entirely different things than which hemisphere is dominant. So, without further ado, I will move into the subject of the neuroscience of one specific educationally relevant topic, i.e. the development of maths and arithmetic. And there has been, since it became possible to do brain imaging, including brain imaging of school-age children, there has been a certain amount of study of age differences in maths. And age comparisons in children suggest that there are some changes with age, from predominant use of frontal regions to predominant use of parietal regions for mathematics, possibly reflecting a movement from strategies that are based on working memory to strategies more specific to numerical understanding. And this has been found for mental arithmetic and for comparing quantities. And so perhaps as children automatize their math skills through practice, they may not need to use working memory as much. And experience or maturation, even just getting older, may result in increasing specialization of brain areas associated with maths. Though it's not total, even 4-year-olds show some increased activation of the parietal areas when doing problems with numbers. So one may question, though, whether brain differences as children get older or between more able mathematically children and those with mathematical disabilities, do these brain differences cause or result from differences in mathematical ability? Probably both. Kuchian, for example, found that after a computerized intervention, children with mathematical disabilities not only improved their maths, but developed more mature patterns of predominantly parietal rather than frontal activation in mathematical tasks. And you don't need at this, I'm not trying at this stage to give detailed information about exactly which bits of the brain do what, but the main point is that these change with age and that these can change as a result of interventions in maths. Now, another very important aspect of the study of the brain and maths is that arithmetical ability is not unitary. It's not just one ability that you've either got or you haven't. There is increasing evidence from studies of atypical and typical mathematical development, adults who've had brain damage causing mathematical disabilities, and most recently from brain imaging studies of adults' mathematical cognition, and even more recently, children's mathematical cognition. And such studies show that arithmetical cognition is made up of many components, and it's quite possible for children and adults to show strong discrepancies in either direction between almost any two components. So that, for example, one might be very good at exact calculation, but poor at arithmetical estimation, or vice versa. One might be good at written, but not oral arithmetic, or vice versa. And so this has many implications for education and for interventions with children with mathematical difficulties. No two children or adults with arithmetical difficulties are the same, and it's important to find out what specific strengths and weaknesses an individual has, and to investigate particular misconceptions and incorrect strategies they may have, rather than just assuming they're good or bad at maths. And I will briefly describe, finally, the Catch-Up Numeracy project, which I've developed in collaboration with Graham Sigley, Wayne Holmes, and others of the Catch-Up Trust, which is a not-for-profit UK registered charity. And the project is based on a pilot study that I carried out on a very small scale in Oxford. I have the Catch-Up website for anyone who's interested. This shows an adult working with a child at Catch-Up. And the target pupils are children in years 2 to 6 of primary school who have numeracy difficulties, though it's been extended to some degree to older pupils. And schools generally select whichever children they think are likely to benefit. And usually we deal with children with moderate rather than extreme mathematical difficulties. And children are assessed individually by a teacher or teaching assistant using catch-up numeracy formative assessments. And this is used to determine the entry level for each of 10 numeracy components and the approximate focus for numeracy teaching. And the crucial thing here is that what distinguishes catch-up from some other interventions is that it's not based on specific equipment, but on careful advanced assessment and then proposing equipment and techniques that are already available in schools for numeracy teaching. And teachers and teaching assistants get advanced training of equivalent of 3 mornings of training. And children get 2 15-minute sessions per week. And the components aren't regarded as all-inclusive, either from a mathematical or psychological point of view, but were chosen because curriculum documents and discussions with teachers showed them to be educationally important, and research has shown them to elicit individual differences. And the components, which I won't describe in detail through lack of time, include counting verbally, counting objects, reading and writing numbers, adding and subtracting tens and units, ordinal numbers, whether a bead, for example, on a string is 2nd, 4th, or 9th, etc. Word problems, translating between sets of objects and the representation in numerals or number words, say 5 bricks represented by the number 5. Derived fact strategies, for example, that if 8 and 6 is 14, then 6 and 8 must also be 14, and 14 minus 8 must be 6, and you don't have to solve the problems again. Estimation and memory for number facts. And in our first evaluation of the study, we used 493 primary school children, mean age 104 months, so just 8.5 years old. And in that first study, most of them got the catch-up intervention program. 50 got the same amount of time for individualized maths work, but not targeted, and 48 received no intervention except usual business as usual school instruction. And they were all given a number screening test before and after the intervention. All groups were similar in age and chronological age and number age. We did a statistical analysis comparing the groups on the months gained in mathematics age divided by the number of months between initial and final testing, i.e. the amount of time gained in chronological age. And the children who got catch-up intervention made more than twice as much progress as would be expected from passage of time alone. Those who got match time intervention about 1 to 1.5 times, 1.5 times as much. Those who received no intervention show progress slightly less than would be expected through the passage of time. And we found that there was a very significant effective group, so that the catch-up intervention group made significantly higher gains than either of the other groups that didn't differ from each other. And a later study comparing catch-up children with a similar number, about 300 in each group, of children who had business as usual. Should similarly catch up. Children did a lot better. So to conclude, individually targeted interventions seem effective, but interventions that focus on particular components may be more effective than one size fits all. There are a lot more studies need to be done, and we need much more systematic research to compare different intervention programs, and very likely different groups would be suitable for different groups of children. And if we find out which program works best with which group of children, then this may not only be important educationally, but may have implications for further research in neuroscience and in how components of arithmetic might be represented in the brain, and whether intervention affects brain organization. Okay, so thank you very, very much for listening. I hope the technology worked reasonably well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dowker. Everything worked perfectly. So we now have 10 minutes for questions for our speakers so far. Please do feel free to continue sending questions if you have anything you'd like to ask. So the first question I have is for Dr. Glitsch, and this is from Deb Fisher. What exactly does the speaker mean by consciousness?
Oh dear. I guess an awareness. That can be self-awareness, or that can be awareness of the internal state. So for instance, as a neuroscientist, an emotion to me is a physiological response to a stimulus. That could be the dilation of a pupil, that can be an increase in my heart rate. A feeling then is my conscious awareness of the changes in my body. So it is then that I say, okay, I'm scared, or I'm happy, or I'm angry. So
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, if I may,
it's a very big question.
it is a very big question, and if people can hear me, I think that's one that will come up in the philosophy section, so we can come back to it at the end, or once I've had something to say about it.
And no doubt philosophy will have far more to say about it than I do.
Thank you. And I have another question from B. Windsor for Dr. Glitsch, who is an A-level student, B. Windsor. Do any other animals have the ability to make conscious decisions about their movements in the way that humans do?
I guess the difficulty here is how would we determine that? How would we know? Animals can't speak a language that we understand, and therefore we can't kind of ask them. I would imagine that certainly I would have thought this is something that primates can do. There's no reason to assume that humans are different to other primates. I would even go so far to say that probably a lot of hunters can do this. If you think about mice, for instance, prey animals don't really have an option, but if they see a movement, they have to look towards the direction of the movement, because simply a movement might mean danger for them. A hunter, on the other hand, has the privilege of focusing their attention on one spot and ignoring any other movement that goes around, even for a hunter, it might be important to know what's going on. The best example is a cat who can focus their attention on something that, well, we don't see, but the cat sees. So the question is whether that's a conscious decision or whether that is inbuilt. So we don't know, because we can't test. I don't know how we design an experiment in which we know whether an animal willingly changed a behavior or not. That's not possible for us to do because we can't communicate. But I would imagine that primates can do this, but we're not the only ones who can do it.
Thank you. Now I have a question for Dr. Dowker. This is from Emma Knights, who's a university student. How do we ensure that teachers incorporate the latest programs rather than falling back on neuroscience myths?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, and I would love to know the answer. And one of the obvious issues include incorporating the latest research into into courses in education, and then into continuous professional development for teachers, to perhaps develop blogs and websites which teachers can use, which give the information in relatively easy to process form as one can, as it's unreasonable to expect that teachers will be able to search all possible articles after a hard day of teaching pupils. So one has to select and provide the most relevant information for them. And there are indeed some websites and blogs in existence that are very useful for the purpose, but these need further development. And also this refers to teaching them what is going on, but also to have a more publicity for the mythological nature of neuromyths, and in particular make sure that myths are not taught in education courses, which has sometimes happened.
Thank you. And I have another question for Dr. Dowker, which comes from Ellen White, who is a trainee educational psychologist. Ellen asks, how can the findings from the catch-up intervention inform general math teaching to support all pupils from the beginning?
That's a very interesting topic, and because the majority of pupils will not need specific interventions, nor would it be possible to deliver it to them. But I think the way of what the sort of things that are supported would be awareness that particular aspects of maths may be differentially difficult for different people, so not to assume too readily that some children are just bad at maths, which tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, especially in these days of computers, adaptive computer programs and computer games to help kids and indeed adults with different aspects of number and arithmetic.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple more questions. I have another question for Dr. Glitsch. Let me have a look here. So this is a question from Jasmine Patel. Are there differences in the methods of encoding of movements in the different areas of the brain that you mentioned?
No, the brain works in terms of action potentials, and the frequency of action potentials and the patterns of action potential firing encodes the message. The difference lies in the targets and in the message that is conveyed, but the actual underlying mechanism will always be an action potential, so a change in electric potential across the membrane of a cell.
Thank you. I have another question here from Nathaniel Dixon, who's an A-level student, and this is also for Dr. Glitsch. What is the evidence for synaptic plasticity, and how is it measured if it is?
Okay, so synaptic plasticity we can measure in different ways. There are morphological changes in synapses as they mature, as they get exposed to more activity. So they change their shape, hence the term synaptic plasticity, so a change in their actual shape. We can also measure electrophysiologically. So we can measure the currents that cross the membrane when a neuron releases neurotransmitter that opens gates in the membrane of the postsynaptic cell that permit the passage of ions into and out of the cell. And we can measure an increase in the passage of ions in the form of an electric current, because ions are charged particles. And when charged particles move, you get an electric current. Just like when water molecules move, you get a water flow. And so we can water currents. So we can measure electric currents, and we can see that they increase or decrease depending on the experience of a synapse.
Thank you. And we have one final question, and this is for Dr. Dowker, and it comes from Lucy Stubbs. She asks, what examples are there of successful interventions in the design of teaching and learning of other STEM subjects that are based on psychology and neuroscience?
Very interesting. There's been quite a lot of work on reading development, for example, which is some of which is based on our understanding of what reading-based activities are regarded as different components of the reading process. There have also been a number of studies which have actually looked at brain functions following intervention, and some of these studies, for example, by McClelland and his colleagues, have shown that just as I was saying with maths, reading interventions that improve reading also make the brain patterns on functional brain imaging are more similar to those of non-dyslexic typical readers, which again indicates that there's more brain plasticity in terms of development of function than has sometimes been thought, and that the mere fact that things are shown by brain differences doesn't mean they're immutable. It may mean that brain changes may may actually result from intervention. So yeah, there's been quite a lot with regards to reading as well as maths, rather less, I'd say, with regards to other subjects, and it would certainly be worthwhile to do more, look at science, for example, from this point of view. It's also worth noting that a lot of research has shown more general effects on learning of, for example, sleep, that going to sleep actually improves one's ability to lay down memories of what's once been taught. For example, after waking and for control groups who not have the opportunity to sleep. So there's some quite exciting results overall.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes until the break. We have time for just one more question, and I think we have a nice one that's to both speakers. So can you please explain how both perspectives we have looked at link the mind to the brain in short? So I guess each speaker could give their own opinion on that, and this comes from Amelia Cornell.
Okay, so to me, the mind is a physiological process that happens in the brain. The brain is the site where it happens, and the mind is essentially the result of thoughts, ideas. They're all the result of synaptic transmission in the brain. Very pragmatic view.
Thank you.
And I would reinforce this. I mean, I would say the mind is basically what the brain does. The brain also does other non-conscious processes, but the brain is definitely the organ that does our thinking. And some of the studies that I've mentioned that show that interventions that improve reading or maths that also appear to make the functional organization of the brain for these activities more mature or more simple. So I would say the brain influences the mind, which to me, as I think to Maike, is not a totally separate entity, but is a function of the brain, and that the mind in turn influences the activity of the brain.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone for such interesting questions. And I'm sorry that I didn't have time to put all of these to the speakers yet, but we do have another question and answer session coming up later. So please continue to ask your questions. We will now have a quick break from 6:05 until 10:10. So we look forward to seeing you back then.
Welcome back, everyone. We now come to the third part of our event, which is the philosophical section. And it is my pleasure to welcome our third speaker, Dr. Anita Avramides. Dr. Avramides was the Southover Manor Trust Fellow in Philosophy at St. Hilda's College for 30 years and was awarded a Senior Research Fellowship in 2020. She works in the philosophy of mind and language and has published extensively on the topic of other minds. Her latest book, co-edited with Dr. Matthew Parrott and published by Oxford University Press, is entitled Knowing Other Minds.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Well, good evening. And I hope you have a little mental energy left to listen to just one more talk. I'm now going to do the hardest thing that I have to do tonight, which is share my screen. So bear with me and let's see if I can do that. There we go. I think I've done it. Good. So now some of you may have been perplexed to read the topic of tonight's event, but not by some of those questions, which I think you'll get a bit of an answer. For those of you who were perplexed, you may have wondered what there is to understand here. After all, if we want to understand the mind, we study the brain. Whoops, let me see. Let me just get there we go. What more is there to understand? What we need to understand, some will say, is just the workings of the brain. In this short talk, I'm going to try and convince you that understanding the mind is a more complex business. Tonight, we're focusing on the question of how we might understand the way in which these two things, brain and mind, fit together or relate to one another. And I use this word thing very loosely, especially in connection with the mind. If we stop to think about it, the brain is fairly straightforwardly a thing. It's a physical thing. Here are some other physical things: tables, cars, thermometers. Like these physical things, we can put a brain on display before us. We can cut it open, touch its squishy substance, study how it connects to other parts of the body. Basically, we can study how it works. If we now turn to consider mind, things are somewhat less straightforward. I sometimes ask my students, if they were asked to put a mind on the table, what would they put there? I ask you to think about that now. Maybe some of you will put a brain on the table, but perhaps there are some who will put a whole body on the table. And if the latter, I wonder if I would find only human bodies, or whether someone might put a cat on the table, a bat, or even an ant, hence the question we had in the first Q&A. How might we decide who put the right thing on the table? My point is that it's much harder to know what kind of thing a mind is, or even if it is any kind of thing. Let's now consider what we're talking about when we use this word mind. We use it to refer to a collection of activities that most adult human beings go in for. And for this short talk, I'm going to leave aside other creatures. That's a very hard question. We might agree that these activities include thinking and feeling. In this connection, we talk of having beliefs, desires, hopes, expectations, and the like. We talk of a range of emotions, anger, fear, resentment, and the like. And we most likely include feeling pain, experiencing joy, and the like. All these activities are connected with having a mind. Maybe you don't need all of them to count as having a mind, but I trust you get the idea. Again, think how one might put a belief, a desire, a pain, or a fear on display on a table. It seems more likely then that one will be disposed when thinking about the things that make up the mind, that one will put a whole organism on display. In the case of an adult human being, we might show a person looking at the world, having a belief, reaching for a bowl of ice cream, exhibiting desire, wincing and crying, suffering pain, or trembling before a growling dog, exhibiting fear. Now, you may agree with all this, but be impatient to pull me back to the subject of my talk by saying, it's all well and good to talk of these activities of mind, but we now know that all of these are controlled by the brain. And in this, I cannot but agree. Of course, the brain controls behavior, or at least it controls the movements of my body that display the behavior we call believing, desiring, feeling pain, and the like. But what is it we want to understand here? Do we want to understand what controls the activities that constitute what we call mind? Well, yes, and this is important, indeed, vital understanding. But I think there's something more that we want to understand. It's clear to us now that the brain controls the movement of the bodily limb. And we might build a system, call it a robot, that has a control center that controls the movement of artificial limbs. Have we now understood what it is to have a mind? Well, some might say yes, that's all there is to understand. If we can design a system that can do certain things, move in certain ways, then we've designed a system no different from ourselves. The philosopher Dan Dennett thinks something along these lines, and many of you may be familiar with his work. He's the author of, among other books, Consciousness Explained and Brainstorms. But I would suggest that building such a system, while it explains a lot about us, also leaves a lot to be explained. Many of us may not yet be convinced that such a system really does have beliefs and desires, really does have hopes and fears, really does experience joy and pain. In other words, we're not convinced that such a system really is like us. But what's been left out? What more do we want to understand? Well, the answer lies in the word really that I've been emphasizing. Maybe such a system moves like we do, but there seems more at stake here than just how we move. It seems like we're asking something about what's going on in the interior of this system or creature. Again, I urge caution. When I say in the interior, I don't mean literally inside the skin or outer parameters of the system or creature. If that's all I meant, then we would simply have to open up the creature and examine its insides. But what would we find there? Find in there more physical stuff and that all-important control center. No, when I say that there's more at stake and that this has to do with what's going on in the interior, what I mean is that it has something to do with how things are for that system or for that creature. We're asking about the subject's or creature's subjective world. For all that that creature may be made up of skin and bones, nerves and muscles, and for all that it's controlled by a brain that is itself gray matter constituted by, among other things, axons and neurons, for all this, we want to understand the something more that makes us talk of human thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Again, I'm going to refer to the work of Dan Dennett. Dennett would say that we just don't know what we're talking about when we use these words. We think we mean something coherent, but on reflection, we have no coherent notion of what we're talking about here. Yes, we're in pain, but being in pain is nothing more than the sum total of the organization of the system, and that includes in large part the working of the brain in the body. Now, I think both of our speakers earlier hold Dennettian line here. So if we can replicate this, this working of the brain in the body, then we've replicated a thinking, feeling system that itself thinks and feels. More recently, philosophers following in Dennett's footsteps insist that we're under an illusion to think that there's anything more here. But while some philosophers agree with Dennett, many do not, and I'm one of those. I do not think that my use of words like pain are incoherent when I move away from talk about the way my body works. And I would suggest that if I'm under the illusion that I'm in pain, then I'm in pain. Think about it. How do you distinguish pain from the illusion of pain? I may not be able to say a whole lot about my pain that sounds coherent to someone like Dennett, but I think I'm aiming to talk about something that I recognize from the inside. I recognize it because I feel it. This is what some philosophers refer to as the phenomenology of pain. The philosopher David Chalmers has written a book entitled The Conscious Mind. The adult human mind is conscious, and it's this consciousness that we seek to understand. But Chalmers helpfully teases out two concepts here. One is what he calls psychological consciousness, which he associates with what psychologists mainly study. That is associated with the activities of perceiving, learning, and various forms of information processing. The other concept Chalmers calls phenomenal consciousness, which he associates with the following very important question. Why does the feeling which accompanies awareness of sensory information exist at all? It's phenomenal consciousness that Chalmers and others associate with what they call the hard problem of consciousness. Thomas Nagel puts the point in a most engaging manner. He asks that we consider the taste of chocolate. You bite the chocolate, it melts on your tongue. Chemical changes take place on your taste buds, which send electrical signals to your brain where physical changes occur. Now consider a neuroscientist examining your brain as you eat the chocolate. All she would see is the activation of various neurons in the gray matter of your brain. Where would this neuroscientist see the taste of chocolate? Chalmers thinks that it's relatively easy to understand how we process information, and I use the word relatively here advisedly. He appreciates just how difficult the task is. But what he is saying is that the difficulty here is of a different order to that associated with understanding phenomenal consciousness, understanding what it's like to taste chocolate. Why is this? Let me try to explain the difficulty by laying out just a few proposals there have been for understanding the mind-brain relationship. One simple theory is that the mind is the mind-brain identity theory. It's a simple theory in that it just simply says the mind is the brain. These theorists want us to think of the relationship here on the model of water, which just is 2 hydrogen molecules and 1 oxygen, H2O. The identity theorist is the person who puts a brain on the table when asked to put a mind on the table. So the idea is this: we accept that water is H2O, and in the same way, we should accept that the mind is the brain, or that mental states are just brain states. Now, there's a rather simple problem with accepting an identity in the case of mind and brain. I can imagine going to the doctor's one day, and he looks at my brain and exclaims that I must be in great pain. But I do not concur. I hope you can see on the slide, I found a rather nice slide, the woman is looking not too interested or too in agreement with the doctor. Now, the question is, am I in pain or not? For my part, I would say that if I don't feel pain, well, then I'm not in pain. My body may be damaged, but this isn't the same thing as feeling pain in a part of my body. Some have proposed a relationship weaker than brain and mind identity. And it's this is a little more complicated. They hold that if two creatures share all their physical states, then they will share their mental state. So that's the picture on the top. The view differs from the identity theory because it allows the two creatures may be alike in all mental respects, but different physically. I hope the bottom picture shows you that. The relationship I just described is called in philosophy the supervenience relationship. And this is a fairly complicated idea, and I'm only mentioning it for those who are more advanced in their knowledge here. All I want to say about the supervenience relationship is that it's very complicated and it's not at all clear exactly what it explains. Now, there's another different and very popular way of accounting for the mind, and that's functionalism. According to functionalism, pain isn't to be identified directly with any part of the body like the identity theory, but is to be identified by reference to a whole functioning system. One finds that state in the system that arises as the result of certain inputs, which state interacts with other states of that system, and which state then gives rise to certain outputs. Now, functionalism has proved extremely popular, in part because it allows that creatures who are composed of stuff very different from human beings still experience, say, pain. Functionalism allows that we might come upon creatures on a faraway planet who may not be carbon-based, but who may respond to their environment in the same way that we do. And it's on the basis of this observed relationship to input and output that we can say that they experience pain. The functionalist is the person who's likely to put a whole human body on the table when asked to put a mind on the table. But what many find that functionalism is a very good theory. Others find that it's not helpful when it comes to understanding phenomenal consciousness. What functionalism looks custom-made to understand is psychological consciousness. It's not hard to imagine creatures who feel pain but respond very differently to it, or respond as we do, but don't feel pain. So I've briefly touched on only 3 ways that have been proposed to account for mind. There are many more. More recently, there are those who've resuscitated a view that was popular in the 19th and early 20th century and is associated with, among others, Bertrand Russell. This view holds that we should not think of mind and body as separate, but rather as one thing, mental physical. This sometimes gets called neutral monism, and it's a view held by those who are called panpsychists. Panpsychists hold that mind is a fundamental part of the fundamental stuff in the world. This view has one big thing in its favor. It gets around the problem of understanding how mind comes into existence in a physical world. It does this by postulating that mind is there from the start. It's part of the fundamental stuff of the universe. While it does this, however, it requires that we accept that the natural world, that is, rock, sand, trees, etc., are just a little bit conscious. Some find this very hard to accept, and I'm one of them. Let me now draw my remarks to an end. Tonight, I've given you the tiniest flavor of a small variety of responses to what philosophers call the mind-body problem. But it may be thought that I've been unduly negative about the various proposals on the table. Does this mean that I'm suggesting that we return to a position we find in the work of René Descartes? Am I a Cartesian dualist, someone who believes in immaterial souls that are distinct from the physical body? Not at all. Like most all philosophers of today, I hold out the hope of a purely naturalistic understanding of mind. But that doesn't mean that I will accept any theory. I'm on the lookout for a theory that really does yield the understanding that we want. This leads me to my very final remark, which is what it is that I think philosophy can bring to the understanding of the mind-body relationship. One of the most important contributions that I believe philosophy can make here is in helping us to understand what it is we're talking about, what it is we want to understand. This may sound trivial, but it really isn't. And I hope I've illustrated this with the first part of my talk. We want to understand the mind, but do we really know what we're talking about? Dennett tries to convince us that we don't really know what we're talking about in an effort to persuade us to stop trying to seek further understanding here. There's so many books written with the word consciousness in the title, books that aim to explain or give us a theory of consciousness. But so many of these books assume that we know what it is we want explained. It's philosophers who aim in some detail to understand the phenomenon to be explained. Why is this important? For the following reason. Without a very clear understanding of the phenomenon to be understood, we're in no position to judge of any given theory if it's adequate to the task set or not. So, what I hope to have convinced you of tonight in this very few minutes at my disposal is not the truth or even the falsity of any given proposal. Rather, I hope to have convinced you that we really need to stop and ask ourselves just what the mind is, just what the conscious mind is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Avramides, for a very interesting talk. We now certainly have a lot of stuff on the table to discuss, and we've also had several questions come in. And I think these questions are really nice because most of them involve really what all three speakers have been talking about. And so I want to begin by asking Dr. Avramides a question, which comes from Liv. And Liv wants to know about the significance of language when we're examining the relationship between the brain and the mind. And I suppose there are two things driving this kind of question. The one question is, well, what's, if we're comparing the human mind to other beings, we're saying, well, is language significant here? Does it make a difference? But the other kind of question here, I suppose, is more about the particular views in the philosophy of mind, which you've outlined, and looking at what role language plays to our very understanding of the concept of a mind.
Okay. Wow, Liv, that's a tough question. And if I were answering this question 40 years ago, when I was a graduate student, I would have said language is very important, because there are those people who think you can't, back then, who very much thought that thought and language were interconnected. Now, that's not very popular anymore. And part of that is because I think there's quite a lot of work that has persuaded people that cognition is more spread across different species. So then we might ask, well, is language present in those species? So again, we get this question, what is language? Okay, well, I'm going to assume that we will accept for now that there is cognition in creatures that don't have language. Let's say that for now, although I think it is a question. How then do we think about this relationship? Well, I guess if you're going to think about language is behavior. So you could say that language was a particular fine-grained kind of behavior that gave us access to mind. Maybe we should just be looking at behavior more generally. And that would give us a way of spreading out where we find mind by seeing where we find the relevant behavior. And it doesn't necessarily have to be linguistic. I hope that at least gives you a little bit of insight into that question, Liv.
Thank you very much, Dr. Avramides. And I think we can basically take that answer straight into the next question. Actually, there have been several questions on this topic, one from B. Windsor and the other from Zonia Popazov, which, I mean, they really both want to know about the relation between the philosophical approach and the neuroscientific approach which have been taken here. And B wants to know whether there is really a contradiction here between what Dr. Avramides has been saying and what Dr. Glitsch and Dr. Dowker have been saying, or whether these two kinds of approaches can actually be combined.
Can I just start, and then I'll let my colleagues say their piece. I think that a contradiction, I don't know. There's an issue. There's a discussion to be had. That's what philosophy is about. I don't think we have to rush to contradictions. There's a discussion to be had, and I tried to touch on it. I think by making reference to Dan Dennett's work, I think I was touching on what my colleagues may hold, but let them speak for themselves. I mean, as I said, Dan Dennett thinks if you have been able to replicate the system, if you could do everything about the inputs and outputs and all the relationships, etc., that's it. There's nothing more to be explained. And he thinks that any further thing you think there, like the taste of chocolate, he'll say, what taste of chocolate? What are you talking about? Can you tell me anything coherent about the taste of chocolate? So there is a real debate here. And a lot of philosophers, there's a big philosophical debate about whether this is an illusion, whether we're coherent or not. So I wouldn't say contradiction. I'd say a debate needs to continue.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, as a neuroscientist, I tend to be pragmatic. And to me, without synaptic activity, there won't be any mind. As simple as that. But I appreciate that discussions need to be had. The example of using pain is, of course, a really fascinating one. And I would actually suggest we do pain in the brain. At one point, I already have a speaker in mind from Hamburg, Wolf Baumgartner, get going on a talk. Pain is something that every neuroscientist will accept is conceptual. So there can be damage to a body and the person doesn't feel pain, and there can be no damage to a person and the person feels pain. No neuroscientist would dispute that. Pain is one of these things that is a construct that is very difficult, or that we don't fully understand, and there's dissociation from pain, so you can feel pain and then stop feeling pain, etc. So yes, I think a lot needs to be discussed. I have issues with thinking that a rock has a consciousness, frankly. I wouldn't share that view. I'm not sure about the link between language and consciousness, because I'm not sure that the way we define language is necessarily fair, because it's very human-centric. So yeah, I think discussions need to be had. That's why we're doing these workshops.
I would agree with this, and I think that it does depend how you define the mind, and whether you, I suppose I find it difficult to conceive of the mind existing in the absence of the brain, so no rocks, for example. I would agree that not everything that the brain produces is necessarily, or does, is necessarily what most people would consider as the mind, and in particular is not necessarily conscious. I mean, many of the things that you were discussing earlier are in the category of implicit procedural memory rather than explicit declarative memory, for example, and some aspects of some of what the brain controls is even less close to consciousness, so that the brain is involved in respiration, heart rate, etc., which at least if we are in reasonable health, we don't even think about. So that I would certainly, I mean, I think my view is that you can't have mind without some actions of the brain, but you could have actions of the brain without there necessarily being describable as mind.
I think that's really important. I don't think anybody denies that there's a dependence. That's what I mean by saying we're not Cartesian dualists, okay? We're looking for a naturalist understanding of mind. But the nature of the dependence and what that explains, I think, are up for grab, okay?
That's really interesting. Can I just push you on that point a little bit, because this was exactly Sonia's question, really about phenomenal consciousness and sort of what kind of study can help us solve this hard problem. And Sonia was really interested in, is science going to give us the answer to this question? And if it's not science, then what other discipline? Do you think it's philosophy, or do you think we need a different form of study altogether?
I wonder if Anita's example of a robot, artificial intelligence, will provide the answer to it, and we may not like it, or we may like it. If we can create artificial intelligence that can develop a consciousness and a mind, then I think that would be proof, I guess, of a direct correlation.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, I think it gets back to something you said earlier, which is how would we know? Right? This is the dilemma, right? And I think it's one of the things that scientists don't get when philosophers go, and I think Thomas Nagel did it beautifully. He tried to explain there's this phenomenon called subjectivity, yeah, and it just seems different from any physical thing in the world. It doesn't seem to be objective, in the sense that you can't see my subjective states, but you can see my body, you can see my brain, but you can't see my taste of chocolate. And that's what's so perplexing. And I think what a lot of us want to say is, let's stay perplexed. Let's not rush to think there is nothing to be perplexed about here, because it is perplexing. What does it mean? Who knows? Maybe we need to reconceptualize our view of the physical world. Who knows? I mean, a lot of us think we've got to go radical if we're ever going to get a grip on this problem. But again, I'm just telling you one perspective.
Yeah, I think especially with the "you can't see my taste of chocolate," I could probably answer that might depend on your taste receptors that you express in your system. It might depend on experiences that you had when eating chocolate. So maybe you had some positive experiences when eating one type of chocolate and negative experiences when eating other chocolates, or your brain connects to events that actually weren't linked together. So genetics will come into it, experiences will come into it. So yes, I can't look at you and say you will definitely like white chocolate. But if I know your history and if I know your genetic makeup, I can probably say, I can see this here.
But in order to see it, you need to set up a correlation. And in order to set up that correlation, you've got to talk to me.
Absolutely.
Right? If you couldn't talk to me, you'd open up my brain. What would you see? You wouldn't see the taste of chocolate.
No.
That's what we're on about. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about some medical issues that may affect how we taste chocolate, and two different aspects. One is something that's very, very publicized right now, which is that if you get COVID, it's quite likely to impair or to change your sense of smell and taste. So that there was somebody in the newspaper today who said that since COVID disrupted her sense of smell, she now finds the smell of a public lavatory unpleasant, something that generally wouldn't, for example. And people may, and indeed impairment of sense of smell is seen as one of the diagnostic factors in whether you should go for a COVID test. And of course, in that case, one is dependent on somebody or the same person being able to compare how they tasted or smelled in the past and whether it's changed, so that it's self-awareness. Another example that I remember from quite a few years ago is somebody who had experienced a broken nose in childhood. As a result, he could not smell. He then, because he developed other complications of the broken nose, such as headache, sinus pain, and so on, he eventually underwent surgery on the broken nose. And rather unexpectedly, that was not expected to change by that time, he recovered his sense of smell. And it was very interesting that some of his associations had to be learned, so that, for example, for some time he thought that the smell of petrol was actually the smell of the body of a car, because he had that experienced that smell when he was near cars, and it took some time for him to realize it was petrol and not the car. I always thought that it might have been interesting to do, for someone to do research study the same way that blind people who have recovered their sight have been studied. Nobody did, but it is still, I think this is interesting in some ways in showing what one's senses of smell and taste may be influenced by. Also, general cultural learning experiences, so that people brought up in some countries may on average be much more keen on spicy tastes than those brought up in some other countries, for example.
Thank you very much. Well, we're already 3 minutes over how long we said we'd take, but fortunately our speakers have said that they can stay and keep answering questions until 7 p.m. So I will keep asking them questions until that time. So we have about another 10 minutes. There is another enormous question which I received a couple of minutes ago, which I would like to ask because it's also a very interesting question. It's sort of particularly directed towards Dr. Glitsch and Dr. Avramides, and it concerns the problem of free will. Yes, Sophie Clago wants to know whether research such as Dr. Glitsch's research on the predetermination of movements before our awareness of them could tell us something about free will.
Yes, I had that in my talk and then I took it out again. Well, free will as in we can always decide against what we're going to do. We have, but we cannot deny that whatever we do is a result of experiences that we've had, be that upbringing or environment. It'll be a result of our genetics to some extent, and it will be a result of stimuli, of the types of stimuli we receive. And if people have unusual responses to a given stimulus, other people will find that weird and will not want to associate very often with that person. Just think how children can be ostracized if they like certain things that the vast majority of kids don't like, for instance. Free will. I think there is such a thing as free will, and I think cognitive behavioral therapy goes along those lines, and that is that, yes, to recognize that however we respond to stimulus is a result of past experiences, etc., and that we can, once we recognize that this is the case, we can try to counter it, and we can try to combat it and adopt different strategies. So if before, when you were stressed out, your strategy was to eat a lot, once you recognize that, you can on your way to the fridge decide, actually, I'm not going to eat, I'm going to sing loudly to music, maybe, to alleviate my stress that way. So in that sense, there's free will in that we can try to interfere with patterns of behaviors that we have established. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, well, I think this, as our chairman said, is a very big question. And in a sense, it's one that we could have a whole evening on. I'll say a little bit from the philosophical perspective on this. I think that the line that Dr. Glitsch is taking, again, I'm not surprised neuroscientists would take, but of course, and you're not going to be surprised that what I'm going to do is say something like this. First of all, let's see what we mean by free will. And in the philosophy, the centuries of philosophy, actually, they've teased out several different notions of free will. Now, there are those who think that free will is perfectly compatible with a deterministic approach, because being free is just being able to do what you want to do. Now, there are others who say, no, but you have to be free to want what you want to do. And so that pushes the question back. And then those people get called libertarians. They're the hardcore. No, there's something free at the very core of our being. And that's what this literature from neuroscience looks to some like it may contradict. Now, the literature is really up in the air. There's a lot of discussion about it, whether it does show what it claims to show. The idea is, I think, to put it very, very crudely, that it looks like that we report consciously the decision to move after the movement has been initiated by the body. So it looks like the initiation's already taken place and all we can do is stop it. But this idea that we're actually initiating it just looks like it contradicts that experimental work. So, as I said, some people question the design of the experiment, what the question shows. Other people question whether it really does show that we're not free, because you can take other views of freedom. Other people take the line that Dr. Glitsch took. Again, big debates here, and maybe we should do one of these events as well in the future to discuss this question in more depth.
Very interesting, thank you. We still have lots and lots of questions, and we're not going to be able to tackle anywhere near all of them, but I hope that at least the answers that the speakers are giving are sort of quite detailed. So hopefully we're addressing sort of several questions at once. And I think I'd like to finish with a question which comes from Samanyu Kothapala. And it's about the problems that arise from the fact that we cannot see inside the mind. And so the question is, how do we know that people perceive physical things in the world in the same way? And an example given is, does a color look the same to everyone?
I think that's the inherent problem, right? How do you know? I can take the scientific view and I can say that light color is a wavelength, and the wavelength hits my photoreceptors, and the photoreceptors then trigger activity in the visual cortex at some point, and then I see color. However, photoreceptors can be slightly different in each person due to mutations. It might matter how the neurons are exactly connected. There might be more or fewer synapses in some neurons than in others. Who is to say? It's really, really hard. I don't see how we can ever solve that problem of saying what I say is orange and everybody else says is orange, whether they actually see the same color that I see.
Yes, I mean, I think that one can get some ideas from our behaviors, but only to a limited extent. So that we know that some people have genetic deficits in their color perception, and that such people are likely to match to colors which would look different to people with more typical color vision. We also know that different animal species may have somewhat different types of color perception from their behavior again, and some will differentiate colors which others won't. So some of this is simple or not so simple variations in abilities, so that animals that are nocturnal very often don't have color discrimination as such, while some other animals have limited range of color perception, and others, like bees, for example, actually discriminate colors that we don't. And one thing that, at least as I understand it, is interesting with regard to bees is that it's not only that they make finer discriminations than we do, but that they actually perceive wavelengths that we don't. Some things they have some perception in the ultraviolet range, while some poultry, who I think actually have similar, I may be corrected by someone here, but I think poultry have comparable accuracy or refinement of color perception to humans, but in somewhat different range, so that they can perceive some things in the infrared range. And this is demonstrated by behavioral characteristics. However, if one's talking about two people who have typical color perception and who respond differently, and who which apparently respond similarly from a behavioral point of view to color discrimination tasks, one may be able to tell that they can distinguish between the colors commonly regarded as red and green, but one can't tell, or at least I can't think of a way of telling whether they perceive red the same way, that have the same sensation from perceiving something red, and the same sensation as one another from perceiving something green.
Is there time for me to just say something?
Yes, please do. Let's make it the closing statement.
Oh God. Okay. Well, that's a heavy burden. All right. Philosophers used to talk in somewhat old-fashioned language, but I'll make it more contemporary. I'm going to start with the old-fashioned language. We used to say, look, all the photoreceptors and the wavelengths could be exactly the same, but God could have made it that we saw red where another person sees green. Leave God out of the picture. We can simply say things evolved so that different creatures saw different colors with respect to the same wavelength, the same photoreceptors. Now, you might think that's implausible, but it seems possible in some sense of possibility. Even if we accept that, however, I think we can get a happy medium. I think we can accept that there's enough similarity to allow for communication. We seem to be able to communicate. And there we're back to that language that I think it was Liv asked at the beginning. And language is very important. We're able to communicate to a certain degree. Okay. Our behavior, as Dr. Dowker says, shows us that we're able to maybe sort things in the same way. But even though we're sorting things in the same way, we can't be 100% sure that you're seeing the same color that I am, because I may have learned way back to sort things in the same way that other people sort things. Okay, so, but we are able to communicate. We are able to survive. And that's good evidence that something is roughly similar is going on. But of course, there are going to be variations, even if it's not wildly different. There's the context that Dr. Glitsch talked about. And context for each individual is going to be different. I'll feel my pain differently. I might experience green differently because I hate the color. You might like the color, and so you experience it slightly differently. It's more vibrant for you, whatever. So there are lots of issues even here. And I think, the fundamental problem of can we know about the other person's mind comes down to, can we really understand the mind-body relationship? Because if we could just look at the brain and read it right off. But if we can't do that, right, then we're back to having the mind-body problem. So in a sense, this question brings us back to the very heart of what we've been discussing tonight. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of today's event. Thank you to everyone for your questions, which were really interesting and provoked a very interesting discussion. Thank you to our speakers again for your very insightful talks and the wonderful discussion. And thank you to St. Hilda's College, and again, in particular, to Harris Ferguson and Claire Harvey for enabling this event.
And before everyone signs off, just to let you know that the next workshop will be on the 30th of May 2021, and that tonight's event will remain on the St. Hilda's College YouTube channel, where you can also access previous Brain and Mind events. So on behalf of everyone, I'd just like to thank you again for being a part of tonight's workshop, and we very much look forward to seeing you again at future events.
And I'd like to add to that, thanks to Annie and Barnaby for the help.